Welcome to MojoTalks. It's Watch Club yet again. We're talking about Legion Season 2, Episode 6.
Yep, Chapter
14.
14-ish.
I believe.
Yep.
Joined as always by my lovely co-host, Chris.
Hello, Justin.
And this episode was directed by Jonathan Cameron and written just by Noah Hawley this time.
Yeah, going solo.
I'd like to formally apologize to Nathaniel Halpern for calling him Nathaniel Hawthorne. Shout out to Deanna McWilliams in the comments for calling me out on that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess I was just getting my classic literature mixed up with my Legion.
It can happen.
Yeah.
In this show, anything can happen.
Anything.
I noticed a couple of literary allusions myself.
There you go.
We'll get into that.
So all that being said, I think this episode had a lot to talk about. It was a lot to handle.
Who saw this episode coming? I mean, you know, I saw the teaser trailer,
Right, yeah,
you know, on the next Legion. Saw that, so I saw it coming. But other than that, no one was expecting like a David and Amy episode about multiple timelines and a multiverse.
Speaking of multiple timelines, let's get into let's try and untwist those twirly. Let's unravel the mixed up cords.
Let's straighten up those lines.
Yeah, get those branches separated.
Here, look, I kept track of all the Davids. I named them for my own simplicity. Here's what I got. I got Ty Lopez David. I got Down and Out in Beverly Hills David. I got Stroke Victim David. I got Bench Twitcher David, who ends up being Down and Out in Beverly Hills David, I believe. I got Coffee Boy David, who ends up being Ty Lopez David. I got Facial Lesions Legion. I got Pixar Kafka Office David. So there you go. There's a literary allusion. It was a bit Kafka-esque where he was working. I got 2.3 Children Suburban David. I got Physics Teacher David. Very quickly, that one. Easy to miss. And then Our David, a.k.a. Striped Shirt David, a.k.a. Extension Cord David.
It's a lot of branches.
Seeing our David intertwined with all the other Davids was really interesting. The other thing that I noticed was that while it seemed like these were all taking place on their own individual timelines, there were a few shots that kind of tied the timelines together and made you believe that these Davids were coexisting in similar worlds somehow. At one point we see that Coffee Boy David,
Heavily medicated David.
And
Bench Twitcher David,
yes,
as I called him,
yeah.
who ends up, I think, being Down and Out in Beverly Hills David.
Well, that's the thing. So I thought the same, but then there's another shot where we see Down and Out in Beverly Hills David rolling by a heavily medicated David's place of work, his dairy
warehouse
facility.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if we're meant to take those shots literally. Like, are these indeed different branches of David existing in the same space, or are we just seeing these poetic shots that are meant to tie these stories together, but are not necessarily meant to be taken literally? It's hard to tell. I'm
not even sure it matters,
right?
Because, and so we'll move on the conversation. Won't dwell here too long, but that kind of bugs me a little bit. You know, like I want things to matter. Like that's a question I have going forward. How standalone is this episode? How much of a diversion from the plot, which was moving forward quite fast this season, was this? So I don't know.
I think that's super interesting, and we should get back on that in a bit. But before we do, some other big moments from this episode. I really liked is a strong word, but the scene with David and the police was heart-wrenching and hard to watch and terrifying. The effect of the cop being crushed into like nothingness was genuinely hard to watch.
Yep. To me, what made that really effective was you got two different flavors of scary, right? The first one is like, it is like a socially relevant sort of scary, you know, like the cops rolling up on David, who seems to be an erratic person. It felt so real. Like, this is a narrative we've seen. Like, there's nothing wrong with him, but it's going to spiral out of control because cops behave the way that they do.
Right.
And then you get a second degree of scary, which was like when he like Cronenberg's the guy, basically.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. The other thing that this episode left us off with was when we finally recap with our David. It's right before he's admitted to the hospital, where a good chunk of season 1 takes place, and we kind of get this montage of season 1, basically up to the point where Farouk turns Amy's body into a new vessel for Lenny. And normally in shows when they kind of do like a quick recap in the middle of the programming,
Feels like a clip show.
yeah, it feels like one of those classic, we're stuck in an elevator, so let's remember all the fun stuff that we used to do, way of saving money on old sitcoms. But this actually felt really relevant, and the reason for that is season 2 and season 1 have felt almost like 2 different shows in a lot of ways. And it was nice to be reminded of the trajectory of one character through these 2 very different tones and events. And it was a good reminder of all the things that David has been through and where he's ultimately going.
It's also a new scene that we'd never seen before, right? Amy leaving David at Clockwork.
Right.
So we'd never seen that before, and it was heart-wrenching and difficult. One quick other scene I wanted to point out was the merger scene, right? Where coffee intern David reads the minds of the billionaire bankers. I don't know exactly what it was. But that scene felt like the cold open of a new pilot where it's like Suits with a psychic flair.
Exactly.
You know, I could totally see this show getting greenlit on the USA Network and just being run into the ground.
Absolutely.
And I would like to watch the first couple episodes.
Yeah, I
and
feel
then
like
not
that's
the next 98.
A strong pilot for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Can I talk to you for a minute?
Who are you?
So, Watch Club, that means we talk about some of the things we may have missed.
That's part of the definition of Watch Club.
Then, in that case, every week I like to, do some Marvel Comics callbacks.
That's right. You're our resident comic book expert.
This week, when we at first glance we get a shot of old David, and he's got a bald head. I was like, oh, is that a Charles Xavier reference? Since Charles Xavier is David's father in the comics, and it's lightly been established that is also the case in the show. And I was like, oh, maybe I'm reading too much into this. Old people are bald. It's entirely possible that he's just bald. Then later in the episode, we see that he's in a wheelchair as well, after being, it seems like he's been paralyzed in that incident with the police.
Yep.
So I was like, okay, this is very clearly a reference to Charles Xavier in a kind of dark way. Like normally you'd think, oh, a comic book reference, that's kind of light and funny, but to see David all decrepit and paralyzed and having to be taken care of by Amy was really sad. So that's a sad thing you missed.
It adds almost like another layer to this whole multiverse discussion, right? Because it's like not only could David have wound up this way, but Professor X could have wound up that way.
Right.
Like the
Yeah,
whole
that's a good
X-Men
point.
universe maybe, wouldn't have happened in another timeline.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it.
Here's another, what is the word? Intertextual. Intratextual. Can you tell I studied English literature? Allusion in the show. This was to Clockwork Orange.
Right.
When the guys come up and they're beating on down and out Beverly Hills David in the tunnel.
Some good old-fashioned ultra-violence.
That's right. Some bad Malchiks come up and they're beating on him. This might be irrelevant, other than the fact that like we already have Clockworks. Which,
interesting.
Yeah, which I think kind of sets the stage for a reading of Clockwork Orange.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know where else to go with that.
Yeah.
But hey, Clockwork Orange.
Clockwork Orange. Saw it too. Another thing that you see in that scene, I noticed this and I thought this was an interesting touch, is the first time we see David use that power that basically seems to erase people, it actually leaves behind their shadows. So we see that in that scene, and then later on in the scene with the cops.
With Division 3.
We see that when he even gets rid of like objects like cop cars and stuff, it seems to leave behind their shadows, which I thought was a weird and kind of scary touch. I'm not sure what it means, but it was like a slight little thing that you may not have picked up on.
Maybe it's telling us like the Shadow King is there somewhere. Here's a tiny little thing that I don't know what it means. I'm not even sure if it is a thing. When in Ty Lopez David's house by the pool, there's an uprooted tree, which I don't know what to make of that, but it's one of these little touches where you're like, there's a story in there of how that uprooted tree got there. But anyway, what I was going to say is the donkey. There was a donkey by the pool. I think we saw a donkey in the last episode where Lenny is being carried out of the desert over the back of, I wasn't sure if it's a donkey or a mule.
Looked too small to be a horse, but yeah, it could very well be a donkey.
So I don't know, but they're bringing back their farm animals. They're being economical with their use of farm animals. Speaking of which,
farm animals, David, mustachioed, overly medicated David, works with dairy products.
Yep.
And if you recall, a couple of episodes ago, we got the goo cow, the infamous goo cow. So maybe those things are linked. We haven't heard much about the cow since his debut a few episodes ago. So that's a little slight, maybe, connection there.
Well, here's a quick prediction then. I think we're going to see a spin-off series where we have Division 3. They give up their Division 3, international mystery hunting, and instead open a farm. They go to work on a farm. We're going to see a farm comedy starring the Division 3 guys.
Is that the B plot of the psychic banker TV show as well, or are we going to get, are those two separate shows?
It's all part of the LTU, the Legion Television Universe.
I can't wait.
Is it bitter?
Swallow it with water, silly.
Not paying you to talk on the phone.
I gotta go.
Chris, predictions.
Okay, so it's tough to make a prediction in this show.
Yes.
As always. But here's something I noticed, is we're seeing more than once, 2, almost 3 times, we're seeing David's, this ultra power of his, this finishing move of his, where he makes everyone disappear. We're seeing that, this uncontrollable power triggered by an attack. We've seen that more than once in multiple timelines, and we have no reason to believe that our David can't also do that, that won't also happen. The question that I have is, when we see it happen, will it be against Farouk, or will Farouk trigger it to his benefit?
Interesting.
That's the question I have, because I feel like it's being set up.
Right.
It felt like at the end of the last episode when he learns that Lenny and Amy have been merged.
Right.
Maybe Amy's dead now? I don't think so. I think what we're actually seeing is like a Lenny-Amy hybrid.
Right.
I think that creature will be threatened. The life of that creature will be threatened.
Yeah.
And we'll see this power triggered.
That's interesting. And yeah, you're right. Normally when we see something like this, when an element like that is introduced, it's not just to be thrown away. And we'll definitely see this ability return in the not so distant future.
Agreed.
So earlier you were talking about what this episode ultimately means in the long run of the show. Was this just a little side story, a little in-between thing to give us a little bit of insight on David? But what I found particularly interesting about this episode was actually how important of a role Amy plays in to the different Davids, and how her role in each David's life kind of has a drastic effect on those characters. Namely Down and Out David, who we barely get to see any of Amy in his storyline, unless you count at the very end where he's cut in half by Carrie and Amy visits his grave at the very end of the episode. I think what this episode ultimately shows us is that Amy has always been a caretaker for David, and that her absence can have an effect on the timeline altogether. So I think, last week it was set up that this is a terrible thing that happened to David, that Amy was turned into Lenny and this awful thing happened. But I think this episode is really showing us that because it's happening to David, it has much grander consequences. So for me, it's not so much a prediction, but ultimately, if this episode is for anything narratively, it's to demonstrate the importance of Amy going forward.
And I think that conversely, it also demonstrates the effect of the Shadow King, because when is the only time that we see the Shadow King in this episode?
Ty
it's
Lopez.
when we see, Ty Lopez. It has become a fanatic in his own cult. He declares himself a saint. He's a megalomaniac and an awful dude who gives his sister nosebleeds. What a jerk.
Terrible.
Yeah, that was
Don't
terrible.
do that.
No.
If you have psychic abilities, don't give people nosebleeds.
Yeah.
Stop!
So that's as good a time as any to wrap this episode up. Guys, thank you so much for watching Watch Club with us. We're on every Wednesday after Legion airs on Tuesday night. If you like movies, check out the Cinephiles podcast, which I am happy to be a part of. We also have another Watch Club series for Westworld that airs on Mondays. And Chris?
Over on Mojo Plays, we have a show and a podcast called PvP, Pitch versus Pitch, where three guys who have never made video games before in their lives pitch a ridiculous video game concept on inconceivable topics.
It's a great show. I was happy to be a part of that one episode.
Check that out.
And guys, thank you so much for joining us. Subscribe to Mojo Talks, ring the bell to see when all the new content is coming down the pipe. And from Chris and I, see you next time.
Ding, ding, ding.